Good morning, everyone. My name is Isra, and I'm from the Arab Center and the Doha Institute. Today we kick our 5th day of the winter school with Toby Matthiesen. I'm sure most of you now know who he is, but allow me to introduce him once again. He's a senior researcher fellow in the International Relations of the Middle East at Oxford University. He holds a PhD from SOAS University, and his research interests include the modern history of the Gulf states, Sunni-Shia relations, and the legacies of the Cold War in the Middle East. He is the author of a book published by Stanford University Press titled Sectarian Gulf, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and the Arab Spring That Wasn't, and another one from Cambridge University Press titled The Other Saudis, Shiism, Dissent, and the Sectarianism. Now I'll leave the mic for Toby to present his second talk for this winter school.
Okay, a very warm welcome to all of you on another, I suppose, historic day. I'm not sure if you've all checked the news, but well, we can probably get to that a bit later. The kind of group of academics here, we thought one thing that would be quite important, is important for us, but also for you, is our questions of positionality. So about self-situating oneself and being really aware of why one is interested in a certain topic and from which position one writes about it. And given that we're all, not from this region and writing about the region, well, it becomes kind of clear, that we have a certain position. But it's also really important that people who might be from a certain country and writing about that particular country are also really aware about how they situate themselves. And why and how they become how they choose their topics and so on and so forth. So given that I've spoken quite a lot about in a sense European history and the kind of confessionalization in Europe, you might have noticed that one of the things that got me interested in these questions in the Islamic world or in the Middle East were also questions of I suppose sectarianism or confessionalism in European history or in the place that I grew up in, which was Switzerland. And Switzerland has a very strong confessional character in a sense. In the 19th century there was a civil war based on Catholics versus Protestants. Switzerland was the base of two key reformators, Luther and Zwingli. In addition, Zwingli and Calvin, in addition to Luther, who was in Germany, obviously. And at the same time, the Catholic Church is still pretty strong, and some of the Swiss Catholic communities obviously still protect the Pope and so on. So there are all of these, and they used to go and fight as mercenaries in the different kind of conflicts in Europe, in particular in the 16th and 17th century. And they used to fight on different sides based on their confessional identity. So not necessarily so unlike some of the things that happened in the Middle East. And so I suppose I was a little bit attuned to these things while growing up, despite the fact that this was not more a kind of very open discourse. It was more of a hidden discourse. Younger people weren't really aware of it. But when you looked at also, for example, where the respective churches were located in the urban environment, you could really see whether this was a Protestant or a Catholic city originally, and so on and so forth. And usually the populations were separated into different cantons according to confessional lines. That became blurred in the 20th century, but basically that's how it was. And I suppose, I don't come from a religious background, but my parents were academics, but they actually came from two different strands of the kind of Protestant tradition. So they would always fight over particular words of how to say certain things, and I never understood what that was. And the differences were so minor, but the fights could be really big, despite the fact one would only talk about a few words. So in a sense, the narcissism of the small differences, as Freud has called this in a different context. And so, because sometimes it's actually when things are much more closer that some smaller differences can lead to quite big fights. So when I started being interested in Arabic and in I suppose Middle Eastern history and politics, for various reasons. I mean, one reason was obviously 9/11 and then the first Iraq War, when suddenly this was all over the news and Muslims were portrayed as really bad and the Arabs were portrayed as really evil people, and you had all these news images of all of that. I wanted to learn Arabic and see for myself what's going on, and so I did that at university in Switzerland, but then went to study Arabic in Syria, and from Syria then also traveled and spent a lot of time in Lebanon, visiting the different cities and so on and so forth, and then a few years later did Farsi and went to Iran as well. And so I suppose it were these trips as a student that really got me interested and more attuned to the fact that, well, there are different confessions. There are also all these different Christian churches I'd never heard of in Syria and Lebanon, but that there was really a really deep historical. Well, there were also very important sites that were associated with this or that group, and over which there were competing narratives. For example, in Damascus or in other places. And then, well, I mean, I suppose when I was in Iran, I was there at the time of the shrine bombing in 2006. So it was similar like today. Suddenly there were huge crowds, and on the university there were all these organized rallies and so on and so forth, and I just really realized, okay, this is something really interesting that I want to just study more and really historicize and understand better. So in a sense, this is how I came to be interested in these topics, and then they never really let me go, in a sense. So I don't know if this was a very good self-situating, but it was at least the start of a self-situating. Now I'm obviously writing from Oxford and London, which are historically problematic places. They're very loaded places. One has to be really aware of it. But you have to write from somewhere, and of course, if you deal with the colonial archive, you also have to be really aware of how that colonial archive was put together, where it's located, what is written into the archive, what is implicit, explicitly, what are the power relations in it, and so on and so forth. And so I don't know, Morten told me I should do something like that, and then we can, maybe some of you later in some of your, at the start of some of the presentations, maybe you can start thinking about something like that too. Morten has some articles that are theoretically relevant that might enlighten us. And I suppose now moving on to what I actually wanted to talk about today, which is kind of how the modern state came, in a sense, to the Middle East, is somehow related to this, because obviously it came largely in the form of the colonial state or in the Ottoman modernizing state that was defensively modernizing vis-a-vis increasing European encroachment and penetration in the second half of the 19th century. And therefore, it is always problematic if you do write from the old colonial centers about former colonies. I mean, one has to be aware of the problematic nature of this. But again, I mean, I think, well, I mean, one has to just be aware of it and try to do as best as one can. So, in a sense, I wanted to continue from yesterday, moving on to the 19th century. The Ottoman state, which tried to centralize and really reform itself throughout the 19th century, that centralization had many different consequences, and some of the consequences were really quite important for for the stories, I suppose, that we're interested in. When you look at Iraq, which is what I'm particularly interested in, you saw that actually the Ottomans were really worried about, because in the reaction to the Wahhabi raids, you had the rebuilding of the shrine cities, partly with money coming from Indian Shia rulers, that was transferred to Iraq through the British Empire. The Ottomans started to be really worried about Shia conversion in southern Iraq and wanted to counter that. And one of the ways in which they countered it was to try to be more state-like in Iraq, and thereby they did alienate some of the tribes, and their policies were in fact quite counterproductive, so that throughout the 19th century you had in Iraq a process whereby at the start of the 19th century the majority of the population in what would later become Iraq were probably not Shia. By the end of the 19th century the majority of the population were Shia. So you had quite a successful conversion and propaganda campaign coming from the shrine cities, despite the fact that the Ottomans were constantly worried about that and would write about it. And so it's only by the end of the 19th century that this very important country with these important historical sites would get such a large Shia population. But as I've mentioned, the Ottomans had a quite ambiguous, in a sense, relationship with Shiism. So the Ottoman sultans also maintained relations with the clerics in the shrine cities, and particularly towards the end of the 19th century, Sultan Abdul Hamid, who was this famous last big sultan of the Ottoman Empire, actually who was very key in these modernizing policies, actually embraced pan-Islam as his key state ideology, and wanted the Ottoman Sultan to be accepted by all Muslims around the world. And he also, he sought to extend that legitimacy also eastwards. And so eastwards was obviously Iran and large Shia populations, and then also in Iraq, where now large Shia populations. So he had, in some ways, to have a better relationship with them. And he hired one very famous intellectual and activist that you might have heard of, Al-Afghani, to come to Istanbul and kind of carry out this pan-Islamic project. And together with a number of Iranian exiles, they actually came up with plans on how to unify Islam and how to have a kind of an alliance between Iran and the Ottoman Empire. But this was always problematic because the Ottomans always wanted the Iranian Shah to somehow come in as a junior partner, and obviously the Qajar dynasty had very little to gain from this, and so in the end it didn't work out. But it's still very interesting to think about that towards the end of the Ottoman Empire, pan-Islam was actually one of its key ideologies. So despite the fact that this pan-Islamic project ultimately failed, it's actually very interesting to see, when we're moving now into the early 20th century, how Shia populations actually reacted, particularly in World War I. So when you look at Iraq, the British at the start of World War I occupied Basra and then moved slowly up to Baghdad, largely for wartime considerations. They had some interests in the Gulf that they wanted to protect. They were obviously in this part of Qatar was also Ottoman, but was taken over quickly in this war. But there wasn't really a plan to occupy all of Iraq. initially, but the populations in Iraq, particularly the Shia, actually fought heavily against the British on the side of the Ottomans. And in the First World War, there was this jihad declared by the Ottomans that was partly inspired by German Orientalists who came up with the idea, well, maybe it would be a great idea for the Ottoman Caliph, who was still the Caliph, to declare a jihad so that all the Muslims would fight against the British and the French. The Sultan declared this, and the clerics in the Shi'i clerics in the shrine cities endorsed the jihad, and some of the southern tribal forces participated in this jihad. You had a situation where, just as the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, significant Shi'i populations were actually fighting on behalf of the Ottomans. So again, important historical fact that problematizes simplistic readings of history. This contributed to a kind of perception in British circles that the Shi'i populations and especially the shrine cities are difficult to control, and that the clerics have a kind of are somehow a little bit well, dangerous and difficult to deal with, despite the fact that Britain, as I've mentioned, through these loans that the rulers of this Indian state of Awadh had given to the East India Company, and they were then taken over by the British Raj, had actually had very, very close links with the shrine cities, so of Najaf and Karbala, and had dispersed a lot of funds there for almost 2 centuries. But by the time that Britain actually comes to occupy Iraq and then create Iraq as a mandate after the First World War, you have a quite quick shift in perceptions of the populations in Iraq, and that is further exacerbated by the 1920 revolt, which was the result of some Sunni Shi'i cooperation in Iraq, but which was largely carried out again by the southern Iraqi tribes, and where also Najaf and Karbala played a big role. And this revolt was basically to drive the British out immediately. And it's in response to that revolt that you have really a lot of reporting in the British Archive, and also by Gertrude Bell, private letters sent home that really actually come so there are a couple of letters by Gertrude Bell, who was this Oriental secretary, who was really key in at least initially establishing Iraq, and was kind of the person dealing with the different factions. She came from an English Protestant background and described the clerics in Najaf and Karbala to the Pope, and was clearly invoking the Northern Irish experience, and said we can't have someone like the Pope here meddling in the affairs. And then she started popularize the notion that the clerics, they're all Persian, and so they're not really Arabs, so we can't have them in this new Arab state that we're building. And so you do see here, for example, a quite clear link between this kind of European confessionalized context and the Middle Eastern context in the age of empire. And in response to that, the Shi'i politicians were largely marginalized. The clerics also issued fatwas banning any engagement with the state for a while. So it was a two-way street in a sense, but it led eventually to the marginalization of Shi'i politicians and of the clerics from politics for almost a century. So this was actually these few years were very significant for the history of Iraq, but also for the history of the wider region. And so Iraq would eventually obviously become a Hashemite monarchy, would be given to the king would be the Hashemite monarch, who would come originally from the Hijaz, I mean, that whole story you must be all very familiar with. I'm not going to recount it, but eventually the kind of British empire in the Middle East would largely be based on alliances with Sunni rulers, and the only exception then to that becomes Oman with the Ibadi Sultan. And when you look at the French experience in Lebanon and Syria, which has been studied in much more detail than I suppose even the British engagement in Iraq, it is here that kind of this more well-known story of French trying to protect the Christians of the Levant after the 1860 incidents. Is being played out, and so France creates Lebanon, Greater Lebanon, with a clear intention of having the Maronites as a group empowered. The Maronites and the Druze quite early on start to portray themselves as nations with clear confessional overtones. Some of the other sectarian groups are not acting as sects yet. In a sense, that becomes later. Many Sunnis don't want to be put in first of all, don't like the concept of Lebanon per se, and don't want to be put in that box. Rather, want to be united with Syria or with a greater Arab state. And the Shia only start to act in a sense as a sect later in the 20th century, more towards the middle of the 20th century. That's the argument that Max Weiss has made in his book, that not all the different sects have to act as sects, as politically active entities at the same time. And I think one of the important ways in which then these new states were very different from the previous, kind of Ottoman polities or these Islamic empires, despite the fact that they already started to kind of modernize and have, some sort of facets of the modern state, was in law. So the late particularly in personal status law. So personal status law is the part of Sharia law where the differences between the madhahib are the largest, and where they have developed there's a large body of literature about the differences, and so there are quite strong differences in terms of inheritance, marriage, and so on and so forth, which relate to personal status law. And it's in this colonial context that particularly Sunni and I mean, so that actually Shi law becomes for the first time institutionalized in separate personal status law courts outside of a Shi state, so outside, in this case, of Iran. And as I found, the first time this happened was actually in India, where the British Raj started to compile law books, textbooks, outlining the different sects, how they would rule and so on and so forth. Because in India, then actually the judiciary was staffed by non-clerics. So these, in some cases, even British lawyers who would be given these textbooks, and then, if someone comes, would ask, so which sect are you from? And then you have to say which one you're from, and then you get kind of judged according to that. And there were actually quite a lot of people from different groups who didn't fit one category. So there's a famous case of the Khojas, who saw themselves as a particular group, but were somehow between Muslim, used in some cases Muslim law, in some cases Hindu law, and as Ismailis anyway were kind of falling in between the lines. So there were a couple of communities that were kind of sectarianized from the top down, in a sense. They had to choose which side they would follow, and once they had chosen that, they couldn't really move out of that. And again, in some cases, this was quite significant because, inheritance is ruled differently, and so there are famous cases which dragged on for a very long time about inheritance matters, and in some cases then the sectarian identity of people started to be investigated in court. Later on, one of the most famous of these cases was in Pakistan, where the sectarian identity of the founder of Pakistan was eventually determined in court because of an inheritance issue. So the French did the same, in the sense, obviously they institutionalized personal status law for the different Christian communities, but they also, for the first time in Lebanon, created a distinct Shi personal status law and Waqf board, and Waqf became obviously another very important institutionalized aspect of sectarian difference. So this is all just to remind you that as I mentioned, under the Ottomans, this all didn't exist, a separate personal status law court. So these were obviously things that the clerics demanded and communal leaders had demanded from the colonial authorities. They didn't come up with that out of the blue, in a sense, but I think it's something that where India plays a very important role, because these textbooks then traveled back to Iraq, and by the time Britain actually creates Iraq in 1920, this has already been going on for a century or more in India. So imperial learning across the empires in this kind of sectarian context, I think was very important. And then there was obviously the question of education, which we've already mentioned. In many of the countries, there were important battles about, what the curriculum would be, particularly the history curriculum. And there was built into some of the national narratives and into pan-Arab nationalism a sense that, depending on how you looked at the early period, that you would have a problem with a particular confessional group. So particularly, the Arab nationalist officials that came to Iraq to build the new state, some of whom were from Syria, wanted to rehabilitate particularly the Umayyads, so the early kind of Arab conquests and so on and so forth. And this obviously went down very badly with the Shia, and so these were some of the early battles about education, and I think built this kind of emphasis on the early period and on a golden age of Islam and the Arabs, which is built into both Arab nationalism to a certain extent, historical readings of Arab nationalism, and into the Salafi idea, are inherently problematic for the Shia and for other groups who might not think that this period was just was the right one. And so, I'm not doing a value judgment here, but this is just often problems always arose when these early periods were discussed. Other issues that came up were obviously the issue of the army, coercive force. So the French particularly recruited from, and the British too, recruited from certain groups to suppress rebellions in other parts of the country, and often would actually recruit from particular tribal groups or ethnic or sectarian groups. And that would later explain recruitment, also once the mandate period ended, would explain trajectories within the armed forces, so particular groups becoming really important in the armed forces. And that would again influence very heavily the later development of these states in the later part of the 20th century. So I think I do have a few minutes, right? So I mean, we've already talked quite a lot about the modern state, and you can ask, we can discuss this, discuss this at length. But I don't want to, I think, end today without making some reference to the. I made reference to the international, I suppose. But I do think that with the American involvement in the Middle East, particularly after which basically came in the aftermath of the Second World War, and then the end of the Mandate period, and the end of the British withdrawal eventually, and the French withdrawal eventually from the Middle East and North Africa, which came later than in other parts of the world. But I do think that a kind of a new dimension was introduced here, particularly also then with regards to the 1979 revolution, because in Iran, I mean, to really understand why the Americans and Iran have such a troubled relationship, you really have to go back to the previous period. I mean, so as we're entering the Cold War, Iran really becomes a key ally of the United States and of Britain. And you've all heard of the 1953, obviously, coup against Mossadegh. So there was a sense that Iran was really kind of the key important country here that had to be somehow on the side of the Americans or of NATO in the Cold War. And there are some very interesting international histories. For example, Roham Alvandi's book Nixon, Kissinger, and the Shah on the 1960s and 1970s, which really show that American Middle East policy basically becomes seen through the prism of Iran and then eventually Israel. But that really Iran is the major partner of the United States in the Middle East, and that the Shah actually gets to decide on many of the policies, particularly in the Gulf, and that these, the smaller Gulf states here and also Saudi Arabia, despite, the earlier oil relationship and so on and so forth, are really the junior partners in the region. And that really becomes, and it's only once you understand how close that relationship was and also how personal that was, and on how many levels they interacted with each other, that one understands what a big rupture this 1979 revolution was. And this is important because Iran, as a kind of, after the Safavid period, becomes a kind of a center of the Shi'i worlds. Many things revolve around it. Under the Shah, obviously, this is not emphasized as the key identity of the country, but that comes back with a vengeance in 1979. And I think that it is in response to 1979 that you have the unleashing of obviously, as I mentioned, the revolution changes the whole regional system and changes the whole international the whole international relations of the Middle East. But it also really changes the power balance in a sense here, and starts to affect all the other countries around it. And it is after 1979 that these earlier kind of polemics and so on and so forth, really it's in 79, 80, 81, 82 and throughout the 80s that a lot of the earlier polemics that I'd mentioned before really become now published again all across the Arab world and become translated into all the languages that are relevant in a sense in the Islamic world. So you have a couple, for example, there's a very famous Pakistani scholar who wrote very vicious anti-Shi'i books, and the Saudis paid for that to be translated all across, into Urdu and into Malay and Bahasa and so on and so forth. So you have, in response to the Iranian Revolution, an anti-Shi'ism that is not really very prominent anymore in the 70s or 60s or even 50s. So in the earlier period of the Cold War, when it is really much more of a left and right and so on dimension. One reason for that is, I think, because is that the Iranian Revolution, I mean, at least in its early stage, very, very much was not seeing itself or trying to portray itself as a particularly Shia revolution. It wanted to be a pan-Islamic revolution, and in the first, and not even only Islamic, so you had many secular and leftist people, leaders of the region also visiting Iran and so on and so forth. So you had, in the first few years, also the Muslim Brotherhood and Sunni Islamic movements had very strong links to the Iranian Revolution, and I think that really scared a lot of the kind of Sunni authoritarian leaders in the region, including Egypt, but also particularly the Saudis, and led to and Pakistan. So you have to remember, Pakistan also just underwent a military coup just at the same time. So you have in 78, 79, and 80, and then also with the start of the jihad in Afghanistan, you had a real total recalibration of the regional system that allowed for, I suppose, for the situation that we're in now, and that many of you are kind of writing on more current topics or more the last few decades. So I suppose it is from 1979 on that this becomes, you know, that it explodes again, but some of the older kind of historical narratives are still really key, and I suppose the struggle is how to figure out how these things hang together and where they hang together. I don't have, you know, the magic torch to know exactly, you know, how that works. But I think without this earlier period, these things couldn't have been so explosive after '79. And you want me to stop, right? I'm rambling on, but I mean, I do think we can't. You know, we've been talking quite a lot about things that are not so related to current affairs. But I think, you know, if you now look at the ways I mean, the Iranian Revolution was really such a big trauma for the Americans. I mean, if you see now that Trump said, you know, he wants to have, he has targets for each of the hostages taken in 1980 in the American embassy. I mean, this is insane. You know, most people wouldn't even know what that is, and we were all not alive. I mean, most of us not alive back then. This is really, so in a sense, sometimes it might also make sense to analyze the American leadership more in the way we would analyze a kind of authoritarianly. I mean, we would, like, you personally, you know, what are the grievances that they have, you know, why, you know, what were their formative moments? And there were quite a lot of people who are now in government who had their formative moments at that time and felt really insulted that at the height of the Cold War, when, you know, even the Soviet, even the embassy in Moscow would never be, you know, attacked like that. In a second-rank power would you know, take over the embassy and really humiliate the United States like that. And in some ways, it's this longer kind of trauma that is now playing out very, very dangerously, and it is from 1979 on that the Sunni-Shia issue cannot be seen in isolation from the relationship between the United States and Iran in particular, and the United States and Saudi Arabia, and the United States and Pakistan, and so on and so forth. So I would always really caution against using the Sunni-Shia issue as an explanatory, you know, as the key explanatory factor for something. It's not that what I'm trying to do, but it's just we have to take it seriously and study it. Why is it relevant? But it's not the key driver of everything. So 2 days ago, when I came home after this workshop, I turned on CNN, and there was Vali Nasser on Fareed Zakaria's show saying that, well, actually, it's really the Sunni-Shia issue that's the problem here. You know, after the United States has just assassinated the top commander of a sovereign country, something that apparently hadn't happened since the Second World War, when they killed the top Japanese commander. So in a sense, you know, now to use this as the key explanatory factor for conflict here is not okay. But of course, an internationalized conflict in this region will always be something that will be impacted by this. But I think we have to get our orders of explanation right and take the international dimension really seriously.